The wind came first long before the thunder. It swept across the flatland in ragged bursts, throwing gritting needles of frozen dirt against the windows of the sod house. The glass rattled in its frame, held by rusted nails and prayer. Inside, the air had grown colder despite the cook stove's embers still smoldering. Her fingers, crack and draw, hovered over the kettle, though it had long stopped boiling. The children didn't stir. Outside, the sky had turned the color of leaden bruises. A low moan crept through the doorframe like something alive. It crawled into corners and settled in bones. Ruth stood there, unmoving, her hand resting on the edge of the table where a single crust of bread lay united. Her eyes, dull with exhaustion, stayed fixed on the north wall as though waiting for it to break apart. The baby whimpered from the cradle, a thin sound too small for the storm. Ella and Jonah sat on the floor, shoulders touching, wrapped in the old quilt that still smelled of her husband. The scent had faded, mostly smoke now, and winter wool, but she knew it like she knew the weight of grief. Every stitch in that quilt had been done by her mother Minus in Minus Law's hand, back when there was time for such things. It had been 6 weeks since the fever took him. Fever, or something worse, Ruth had stopped asking. The preacher said God gives and takes. But God had taken too much, and left them here in the center of nothing, waiting for the world to split open. The storm cracked louder, a sound like the sky tearing. She crossed the room, slow and stiff, lifting the baby Sarah against her chest. The child had lost weight. Her legs hung limp like willow branches, and her breath steamed faintly against Ruth's skin. She kissed her head, then moved to the children. Jonah had dirt in the corners of his eyes, the kind that came from hard crying and never fully washed away. Ella's cheek was pressed to her brother's shoulder, her eyes wide and dry, too wide for a girl of 7. "We'll be fine," Ruth said, but the words came out hollow, scraped clean of belief. She sank to her knees and dropped them in her arms. "Just keep warm. Keep still." The wind howled again, this time shaking the door. Ruth flinched. For a second, she thought she heard something else, a night, a voice maybe, or a scream. But it was only the wind, cruel in its emptiness. She rose and moved to the window, pushing aside the rag that hung for insulation. The horizon had disappeared. The storm had swallowed it whole. Not even the barn was visible anymore. Just white, white as judgment, white as forgetting. Her stomach cramped. She cowed and remembered the last meal she'd eaten. A half-minus spoon of Lordan to dry potato, maybe 2 days past. She didn't know. Time had grown slippery. She walked to the trunk near the bed and opened it. Inside was what was left: 2 candles, a dull knife, a Bible with the cover torn, a shirt of his. She lifted it and held it close, inhaling what she could, then folded it again and placed it at the bottom as though the act itself meant she was still alive. Outside, the storm groaned louder. The door creaked on its hinges. The children stirred, eyes lifting to her like little birds. Then a sound, not the wind, a thud, slow and close, then another. Footsteps. Ruth turned sharply, her body tensing. She moved to the door and pressed her ear to the wood. Another step, heavier this time. A shape, a shadow against the snow. No, it was impossible. No one would be out in this, unless they had no choice. She felt her heart begin to race, not fast but heavy, like something dropped into a well. Jonah stood. "Mama?" She raised a hand. Silence. The steps stopped. She unlatched the door slowly, pushing it open an inch against the wind's resistance. Snow blasted in, stinging her face. She squinted. There barely was a figure, bent forward, struggling through the storm. A coat whipped open. One arm held up as if to block the wind. The other clutched something against the chest. She hesitated, then stepped out. The cold hit her like a slap, but she didn't close the door. The figure collapsed to one knee. She ran, feet crunching through the thick drift, and caught the shoulder. It was a man, his face near blue. In his arms, wrapped in what looked like a flour sack, was a girl, maybe 4 years old, barely breathing. He looked up at Ruth, eyes glassy. "Please," he said. "She's all I got." She didn't answer, just turned, gripping his coat collar with one hand, the child with the other, and pulled. The snow swallowed their legs, but she dragged them both toward the open door. Her skirts were soaked to her knees. Her fingers screamed with cold, but she didn't let go. Inside, the warmth what little was left closed around them like a breath held too long. Ella gasped when the man stumbled through the doorway. Jonah moved to help, but Ruth motioned him back. The man collapsed beside the table, his arms still wrapped around the girl. Ruth shut the door hard against the wind, then knelt. The child wasn't moving, lips pale, eyes fluttering. Ruth touched her cheek so cold it made her flinch. She took the girl from him, wrapping her in the quilt without asking, and held her near the stove. The man looked up at her, teeth chattering so hard he couldn't speak. His coat was crusted with ice. His boots had split at the soles. "Sit," she said, voice rough. She pointed to the floor near the stove. "Don't speak yet. Get warm." He nodded, collapsing back. The children stared at him, eyes wide. Jonah whispered something to Ella, but Ruth couldn't hear it. She poured a few drops of water into a cup and pressed them to the girl's lips. "Come on," she murmured. "Come on, baby." A tiny shudder ran through the child's body. Not much, but enough. The man's breath slowed. He was younger than shed first, though this face gaunt, but not age. Sun minus dark skin. A healing scar ran from the corner of his mouth to his jaw. He didn't speak again, just kept watching the girl like the earth itself depended on it. When Ruth finally turned to him, she spoke low. "You came from East?" He nodded. "We tridge." His voice cracked. "That's near 40 miles. Walked it." She didn't answer. Just went back to the kettle, adding a bit of snow to melt what water remained. "Name's Micah," he said after a moment. "Chef's Lily." The girl stirred in the quilt, a tiny sound escaping her throat. Ruth exhaled. "She your daughter?" His jaw moved before he answered. "Not by blood, but yes." Ruth glanced at him again, taking in the way he sat, one hand clenching the edge of the stove like a drowning man gripping a rock. His clothes were threadbare under the coat. He hadn't eaten recently. She knew the signs too well. Ella crawled closer to Ruth. "Is she gonna die?" Ruth looked down at the girl in her arms. "No," she said firmly. "Not tonight." She passed the girl to Ella with gentle hands. "Hold her close. Keep her warm." Ella nodded, proud to be trusted. Ruth rose, took a tin of cornmeal from the shelf, and scraped the last of it into a bowl. She added snow water, stirred, and set it to cook. Micah watched her, his eyes unreadable. "You weren't headed here," she said finally. He shook his head. "Didn't have a direction. Just away." "From what?" He looked at the floor. "A man with too many debts and too much pride. The town turned on me. Thought I stole." "I didn't." She didn't answer. "Her mama died in the fall," he added after a while. "Lost my blood, but the girl had no one. Took her with me." Jonah brought over a dry log, placed it in the stove. Ruth met his eyes and gave a short nod. He smiled, just a little. The meal was small, barely enough for each of them to have a spoonful, but she passed it around anyway. No one complained. Even Micah ate like the warmth itself was a gift. The girl Lily sipped the broth from a spoon, and color crept back into her cheeks. Afterward, the silence deepened. The wind howled against the house, but inside, it felt still. Micah sat back against the wall, arms folded. "You'll go at first light," he said. Ruth didn't respond, just watched the snow press against the window pane like a hand from the other side of the world. "You can stay tonight," she said after a long time. Micah's eyes lifted. "You sure?" She nodded once. One night. He didn't thank her. Just looked at the girl beside Ella, her chest rising slow and even. Ruth turned back to the fire, staring into the coals. Outside, the storm showed no sign of ending. The fire still crackled, subscribed and sit closer. At first light, there was no light, only a grayness that pressed down like ash, seeping through cracks in the sod walls and under the door. The storm hadn't passed. It had settled in, slow and cruel, as if testing their will. Micah sat by the door, wrapped in the same coat he'd arrived in, arms crossed, hat pulled low. He hadn't slept, or if he had, Ruth hadn't seen it. His boots were drying near the stove, cracked and steaming faintly. The girl Lily was curled beside Ella, both of them wrapped in the quilt. Jonah lay on the floor near the fire, eyes closed but not asleep. Ruth stepped past Micah without a word and pushed open the door. The wind had calmed some, but the world was buried. Snow to the windowsills. the fence gone. The barn roof sagged under the weight. She stared for a long moment, then closed the door and leaned against it. "You won't get far," she said. Micah didn't answer. He stood, rubbing his arms, looking around the room like he might find some reason to stay that was pity. "You'll earn it," he said finally. She turned her head. "The food, the fire, a place to sleep. He'll earn it." His voice was level, but there was something under it. Not shame exactly, but not pride either. Ruth didn't speak. She walked to the stove, poured water into the cracked tin pot, and set it to heat. "There's wood to chop. The barn roof's got a sag. Fence is mostly gone." Micah gave a tight nod. She added without looking at him, "You can start when the snow eases." He hesitated. "Thank you." Still, she didn't look at him. She stirred the pot, watching the water warm. Her hands had started to tremble, whether from hunger or relief, she couldn't say. Later that morning, Ruth showed him where the tools were. The axe was dull, the handle splintered. He said nothing, just took it and started toward the trees behind the house. The snow reached his knees, and each step was a fight.
Ruth stood at the door watching him vanish into the white, then turned back to the children.
They worked quietly that day. Jonah fed the fire. Ella helped with Sarah. Ruth tried to stretch the flour, baking a flatbread that filled the room with a smell too good for how little it satisfied. By dusk, Micah returned, arms raw, coat soaked through. He dropped the split wood beside the door and stood there, breathing heavy. She handed him a piece of bread without a word. He took it, nodded, then sat on the floor near the stove again. His boots steamed. His fingers were bleeding through his gloves. "Where do you learn to chop like that?" Jonah asked suddenly. Micah glanced at the boy. "Worked lumber before, north of Sheridan. Cold there, too." Jonah nodded, eyes full of questions he didn't ask. That night the wind returned, harder this time. The house moaned, a low, awful sound like something remembering pain. Micah lay near the door, using his coat as a pillow. Ruth cowed in sleep. She watched the shadows move across the ceiling, felt every breath of cold air that found its way inside. She thought of Sam, her husband's voice, his laugh, the way Hed sat in that same spot long ago, carving little horses for Jonah out of scrap wood. The ache rose in her like a slow tide, but she didn't cry. There was no use for crying anymore. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, Micah whispered something. Ruth turned her head. He was talking in his sleep, face drawn tight, one arm lifted slightly as if shielding himself. "Don't," he muttered. "Don't take her." Ruth lay still, listening. After a moment he quieted. The silence returned. She didn't close her eyes for a long time. At sunrise the world was clean and sharp. The storm had passed. A sky of frozen blue stretched wide overhead. Smoke rose from the chimney like a signal. The trees stood white-minus, slim and still. Micah stood outside, breathing steam, staring at the barn. Ruth joined him, holding her coat tight around her. "Just better," she said. He nodded, still watching the roofline. "Won't last this weather," she added. "I know." She turned to go back inside. I ain't just passing through," he said suddenly. She paused. "I don't know what I'm looking for, but it might be here." Ruth didn't turn around, just said, "We'll see," and stepped back inside, letting the door fall shut behind her. The days slipped into a rhythm. Cold, hard, and quiet, but a rhythm just the same. Micah rose early and worked without asking. He split wood until his palms bled, then mended the fence with spare wire and whatever scraps he could scavenge from the collapsed shed. Ruth noticed the way he moved, not quick, but steady, like a man with nowhere to go and nothing left to outrun. Each evening he sat near the fire, his back straight, knees drawn up. He spoke little. The children watched him with a wary kind of curiosity, like a stray dog who might bite or might just lay down at your feet. Lily grew stronger. She started eating again, small bites at first, then whole mouthfuls. Ruth gave her chores, small things, folding cloths, stirring pots, fetching water from the melting snow in the barrels. The girl didn't speak much, but her eyes followed Ruth like she was studying something she hoped to become. By the second week, the snow had started to melt. Not fast, but enough that mud pooled outside the door and the trees began to show their bark again. The land, once buried, was waking up. One morning Micah brought back a rabbit, small and half-starved, but meat all the same. Ruth cleaned it without comment, and they all ate more than usual that night. Afterward, she watched him sit back and close his eyes, not from sleep, but from something quieter. As if for the first time in months, his body had stopped bracing for a blow. That night, when the children were asleep and the wind had died, Ruth stepped outside. The sky was black and full of stars. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, listening to the distant howls of coyotes. They sounded farther away than they had last week. Micah joined her, boots scuffing the packed earth. "You ever think of leaving?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "I did, after Sam died. Thought about packing the kids up and walking east. My sister lives outside Dodge." "Why didn't you?" She looked out over the fields. "Because I'd rather starve in my own house than beg in someone else's." Micah nodded. "I get that." Silence stretched between them. "You could leave now," she said after a moment. "Storms pass. Roads'll clear in a week or two." "I could," he said. She waited, but he said no more. They stood side by side, not touching, not speaking, just watching the stars scrape against the sky like old scars. Inside, Lily stirred. Ruth heard the soft whimper and turned back to the door. "She still has nightmares," Micah said. "Thinks they'll disappear too. She's not wrong to worry." "I won't," he said. "Not unless you send me." Ruth didn't answer, just opened the door and stepped back into the warmth. The next day he fixed the barn roof. Ruth climbed up with him, holding shingles and balancing as the wind picked up again. He watched her work, and she felt it not like a man watching a woman, but like someone measuring her strength. "You've done all this alone?" he asked, hammering a nail. She shrugged. "Not alone. Had the kids. The land helps when it can." He looked out over the hills. "Land's got memory. So do people." Micah paused, then said quietly, "My brother died when I was 15. We were on a drive. He drowned crossing the river while I held the reins. Never told anyone that part. I let go. I panicked." Ruth glanced at him but said nothing. "H.E.S. buried out near Bismarck," Micah added. "Sometimes I wonder if H.E.D. have turned out better than me." "Better than what?" He smiled, faint and bitter. "A thief who lost one." Ruth looked back down to the barn below them. The wind tugged at her braid. "You're here now," she said. Micah nodded. They worked until their hands, stung in the sun, began to fall behind the ridge. That night, he sat beside her while she mended Jonah's coat. Not too close, just enough to share the lamplight. The children had stopped asking when he would leave, and Ruth had stopped asking herself why she let him stay. Spring came slow, dragging its heels across the plains. The snow receded in patches, leaving behind slick mud and the skeletal remains of last year's crops. The land was colorless and waterlogged, but alive. Faint green shoots pushed up through the thaw, stubborn as rough-sown breath. She was up before the sun now, always had been, but there was a difference in the mornings. A second set of footsteps followed hers out to the yard. Micah never asked what needed doing, he just did it. Repaired the harness, dug the latrine deeper, hauled water without being told. She had never asked for help, and he never treated it like charity. He left once, just once, when Jonah slipped and landed face minus first in the watering trough. It was a short, startled sound, almost like it surprised him. Ruth looked up at that, and their eyes met across the yard. That night she heard him humming. It was the smallest things that unsettled her. Not his presence, but his settling in. The way he moved through the house like he belonged. The way Lily reached for his hand without hesitation, and how the children, hers, no longer looked at him like a stranger. He fixed the lock on the shed, then cut a new step for the porch without asking. He carved Jonah a fishing rod out of cottonwood. Ella started humming the same tune Micah had the night before, and Ruth felt at some old part of her heart, buried deep since Sam's fever, beginning to ache, not with pain, but with want. One afternoon she found herself brushing dust from the mirror in her room. The face that looked back was young. Not anymore. Hair pulled tight, skin drawn, but her eyes were clearer than she remembered. The grief had settled into something quieter, less sure. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Micah stood in the doorway, a muddy bucket in hand. He paused when he saw her, not embarrassed, just still. You look tired, he said. She held his gaze. So do you? He smiled at that. Reckon we both are. Later that week, a rider came from the south, dust minus covered and lean. He arrived at dusk and tied his mare to the post like he'd done it 100 times before. Ruth stepped out with Jonah at her hip and a rifle across her arm. The man raised his hands. Not here to make trouble. Micah came from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His whole body changed when he saw the rider's shoulders stiff, jaw clenched. The man dismounted slowly. "Hello, brother." Ruth froze. Micah didn't move. The man took a step forward. "How'd you ran? Figured you'd find some woman to hide behind." Micah's voice was quiet. "You're not welcome here. This your new family now? That little girl in the house, she ain't yours. Never was." Ruth stepped forward. "Get off my land." He looked at her, smirked. "She yours? You got a soft spot for broken men." The rifle rose. Ruth's hands didn't shake. The man held up his palms again. "All right, just passing through." "Then keep passing." He backed up, mounted slow, then tipped his hat like a man who'd learned to be cruel the polite way. "You'll hear from me," he said. "That girl's still got blood ties, and debts don't vanish just 'cause you do." He turned and drove off into the falling dark. Micah didn't speak for a long time. Ruth stood beside him, the rifle still in her hands. The children were at the window, watching. "Cheer blood?" she asked. "Half," Micah said. "Oh, bad. You steal from him?" Micah shook his head. She asked the thief. "Took everything my mama left me. Lied about it. Said I ran from my girl's death." "Did you?" Micah looked at her then. "No, I buried her. Alone." The wind stirred the grass. "You think he'll come back?" she asked. Micah nodded. "Or worse. House in the law." Ruth looked back at the house. "Then we'll be ready." For the first time he reached for her hand. Didn't pull. Just held it there between them. And Ruth didn't let go. The letter came 2 weeks later. Ham-minus delivered by a man with a tin star and a face too young for the hardness in his eyes. He rode in at midday, dust trailing behind him, a badge pinned to his vest and papers tucked into his saddlebag. Ruth met him in the yard with her sleeves rolled into hoe still in hand. "Mom," he said, "I've got business with a man named Micah Cross. Goes by Micah. No known surname. Maybe traveling with a child." Ruth didn't flinch. "What kind of business?" "Custody claim. Filed by Matthew Cross. Says his niece was taken without consent." Behind her, the screen door creaked. Micah stepped out slow, Lily just behind his legs, her hand fisted into his coat. The deputy saw him and nodded. "You're Micah?" "I am. I got a warrant here. County S put a claim out on the girl. Says she's got blood family, and HES petitioning for full guardianship." Ruth stepped forward. "And you came all this way to serve it?" The deputy glanced down. "Courier dropped it at the office. Just doing my job." Micah looked at the paper, unread. "What happens if I don't hand her over?" The man's voice softened slightly. "You'll be arrested. Shall go into county care until the hearing. If you fight it, things get worse." Lilith's arms tightened around Micah's waist. She didn't make a sound, but her eyes were wide with fear. "I didn't take her," Micah said. "I kept her from starving. Her mother left her to me." "Then you can tell that to the judge," the deputy said. "But the law's the law." Ruth stepped in, voice steady. "She's safe here. She's got a home." "She's not yours," the deputy said. "That's not the part up for debate." Micah looked down at Lily, her face buried in his coat now, trembling. "Can I speak to you inside?" he asked Ruth. They stepped back into the house, the door closing behind them. "She won't survive it," he said quietly. "He'll put her in some home or worse. He doesn't care about her, he just wants to prove him no better than him." Ruth stood still, staring at him. "There's got to be another way," he said. She nodded, slow. "There is. But it's not clean." He looked up. "We don't fight the law," she said. "We use it." That evening Ruth walked into town alone. Wore her good coat, combed her hair. She met with the circuit clerk by lantern light, handed over the savings Sam had hidden beneath the floorboards, wrote her name down next to Lilith's, filed a petition for guardianship under emergency protection, said the girl had been abandoned, that the man petitioning had made threats, It was pretty, it was quick, but it was legal. When she returned the next morning, Micah was pacing by the fence line. "They'll call it fraud," he said, watching her come up the path. "They might," Ruth said, "but by then, the hearing'll be local, and they'll stand up for her. So will the children. So will the preacher, if I ask." Micah stared at her, unreadable. "Just family now," Ruth said, "and I don't let family get taken." He sat down hard on the porch step, as if the air had gone out of him. "Why were you doing this?" She didn't answer at first. She sat down beside him, looked out over the dry grass and the edge of the trees where the light caught in soft gold. "You asked me once if I'd ever thought of leaving," she said. "Well, I don't anymore." Micah turned to her slowly. She met his eyes. "Not since you came." He didn't speak, just looked at her like a man finding shelter after too long in the cold. Inside, the children played. Laughter rose from the floorboards like smoke. Micah reached for her hand again, but this time he didn't hesitate. And this time Ruth leaned into him just enough. The hearing came in May. The morning was dry and bright. The sky stretched out in endless pale blue. Ruth wore the only dress she had that hadn't been mended more than once. Ella braided Lila's hair with careful fingers, trying to keep the tangles from showing. Micah shaved, though the blade was dull and his cheek bore a neck that bled slow. They rode in together, all five of them, the wagon creaking beneath their weight. The courthouse was a small white building near the edge of town, more dust than paint on its siding. Folks stared when they passed. Some knew her, fewer knew him, but no one spoke. Inside, the room smelled of old wood and sweat. A judge sat behind the desk, spectacles low on his nose. Matthew Cross was already there, clean minus shaven, smirking like a cheat already won. He barely looked at Lily. The hearing was short. Matthew's lawyer, a man with polished boots and a soft voice, read from papers and talked of blood rights, property lines, and legal guardianship. Called Micah a drifter. Said Ruth had no standing. Said they were shielding the girl from proper placement. Ruth said little. She didn't dress her words up, just told the judge what she had seen, what Lily had lived through, how she slept through the night now, how she helped with the hens, how she called Joan a brother. "Chestnut blood," the judge said. "No," Ruth replied, "but chest ours." Micah stood then, quiet for a long moment. Then he looked right at his brother. "You never came for her," he said. "You didn't even know where she was until someone told you she had an inheritance." The judge blinked. "She doesn't," Matthew snapped. "She will," Micah said. "Land left by her mother. Not worth much now, but it might be someday." The judge turned to Lily. "Do you want to stay with them, child?" Lily stood near Ella, small and trembling. She nodded once, sharp and sure. "Yes, sir." The judge studied her for a long time, then marked something on the paper. "This court grants provisional guardianship to Mrs. Ruth Alchemy, effective immediately, pending further review." Matthew cursed under his breath. The lawyer placed a hand on his arm. Outside, the wind picked up. The sky threatened rain. Micah didn't speak until they reached the wagon. "You did that," he said. "Not me." Ruth lifted Lily into the seat. "We both did." On the way home, the sky finally opened. It wasn't heavy or violent, just a slow, steady rain that softened the dust and fed the earth. The children reached out their hands, laughing. Ruth tilted her face upward. Let it wash her clean. Micah took the reins in one hand and reached for hers with the other. She didn't pull away. That night the house smelled of bread and rain minus damp soil. Lily fell asleep beside Ella, curled like a kitten. Jonas snored softly from the cot near the fire. Micah stood at the door, staring out into the dark. Ruth joined him, arms folded against the chill. "You staying?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes tired but clear. "If you'll have me." She nodded. "Then stay." He reached into his coat and pulled something small from the pocket. It was a ring worn smooth with age, silver gone soft. "My mother," she said. "A good woman. Never had much, but she believed in keeping things that mattered." He didn't kneel, just held it out. Ruth stared at it, then took it gently and slid it onto her finger. It fit like it was meant to be there. They didn't speak after that, just stood side by side as the firelight danced against the walls and the wind settled quiet in the trees. Somewhere out beyond the dark, summer was coming. And this time, they'd be ready. Every ride leaves a mark. Subscribe for the next one.